Hi, welcome to the Bulwark. The government is about to run out of money again. This has been kind of a common theme throughout this Congress. Constant fights over whether we're going to keep the lights on in Washington, D.C. And as we come to the end of the month of September, once again, we're staring down the prospect of another government shutdown. Just yesterday, House Speaker Mike Johnson's latest attempt to get past this situation blew up on the House floor. He was unable to get his plan, which was blessed by former President Donald Trump, over the finish line that would keep the government funded while also passing a bill that Republicans want to pass called the SAVE Act that supposedly would make it harder for illegal immigrants to vote in elections, which they don't do. But I'm here with our congressional reporter, Joe Perticone, to talk a little bit about what's next, what's happening, whether we're actually going to find ourselves in a real crunch here as we go into the weekend and just where things are going. So thanks for being here, Joe.
Glad to be on. So a little background on what happened yesterday. The House voted on what was going to be a continuing resolution, which just keeps government funding as is until March. And attached to it would be the SAVE Act. The reason why it failed, initially Johnson had pulled it from the floor last week and was like, we're not going to vote on it because he knew it was going to fail. And then he changed his mind and was like, I'll call your bluff. And it ended up failing. It was 202 Republicans voted for it. All Democrats voted against it, all but 3. And then there were about more than a dozen Republicans who voted against it as well. And then Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene voted present. So the 2 present votes, I think, kind of demonstrate the dozen or so no votes, because Thomas Massie is a type of Republican who does not vote for continuing resolutions. He thinks they're bad for the government, and the House needs to pass their appropriations bills, all 12 of them, on time and separately. And that has not happened since Bill Clinton was president. And then before that, it hasn't happened since the 70s. So Congress doesn't do this on time ever, and they just combine everything and they cobble it together, or the government shuts down. That will happen on September 30th if they don't figure something out. The other side of it is Marjorie Taylor Greene, somebody who just is in full Joker mode and doesn't know what to do. And so they want the SAVE Act passed, which makes it illegal for undocumented immigrants to vote, which is already illegal, does not occur in any widespread number. But it also does something like purging voter rolls to figure out who exactly is a citizen voting. It's more of a pretext for denying an unfavorable result in the 2024 elections. That's what it's about. That's why Donald Trump is saying shut down the government over this. Some of these Republicans who voted against it yesterday, their point is that, well, we already passed it as a standalone bill earlier in the year, and so we should be fighting it there, not in the funding fight. It's a non-starter in the Senate, and so there's just really no direction to go in the House other than finding some kind of compromise. That is always how these end up working. And when Kevin McCarthy did it, compromising with Democrats, it was so infuriating that they kicked him out of being speaker. And so that's the line that Johnson has to walk. Does he shut down the government several weeks before the election, which maybe doesn't affect Trump versus Harris, but it has an effect on the House races. So these vulnerable Republicans don't want to be seen as shutting down the government. They've already been a part of the least effective House in recent memory. But they don't want to exacerbate that heading into election day. And so there's all these political dilemmas that all of these members have. And there's really no way out other than the good old-fashioned way of compromise that nobody wants to do yet. Once they're met with the prospect, though, of not being able to go out on the campaign trail at the end of the month, they might change their mind.
Yeah, and this has been kind of the main through line of this whole Republican Congress, right? I mean, in the House specifically, where you have this tiny, tiny, tiny House majority that cannot agree on anything, even internally, in terms of what they want to do with their majority, but that has all of these gigantic complaints and issues and things they don't like about the way Congress currently runs, things they want to get done. Some of those are completely insane, like thinking that the most pressing thing that needs to happen right now is this bill to again clamp down on this non-existent scourge of non-voters voting. But some of which are less insane, right? I mean, it's stuff like being mad that the appropriations process is broken and has been broken for decades, and that we're just limping along with these continuing resolutions all the time for years and years and years. So it's this whole kind of mishmash of good and bad and fair and unfair stuff. But with the result that they cannot come together to agree on anything, which means that if you're gonna get anything passed ever, you need some Democratic input. And then the final ingredient is the fact that ever getting input from Democrats is completely politically toxic for most of these Republicans, such that for a lot of them, they consider it better in their interest to even go so far as to shut down the government than to go along with some bipartisan package that, while maybe not great, while still just kind of keeping us limping along, at least is not having the whole engine fall out of the car on the interstate. And then obviously Donald Trump, as you alluded to, is another big part of this, because he is not intimately involved with these spending discussions. But every once in a while, he'll remember that they're happening and he'll lob in a bomb, right? Which is what happened yesterday, where he essentially said, like, no, I think that the House should be willing to shut everything down if they can't get the SAVE Act as part of this. One thing that I still don't really understand, and we don't need to dwell on this forever, but the role that kind of some Republican defense hawks have been playing in this, like that is another small coalition of kind of malcontents within this Republican coalition right now. What is their angle? What are they hoping to see out of all this?
So anyone who's like defense minded hates continuing resolutions, because the Defense Department always wants more money every year, and a continuing resolution keeps the money flowing at the previous rate. They don't like that. And so every single time a Secretary of Defense testifies, they say CRs hurt military readiness. It's not really clear if that's true. We're not at war. There aren't these outsized risks, but the members of Congress take that very seriously. And it's easier to understand the House dynamic when you realize that there aren't really any moderate House Republicans. They're moderate in their temperament, not moderate in their ideology. And so everyone here is opposed to doing a CR. No one wants to, but they have to because they don't get their jobs done. They have the annual August recess. This year, that August recess was part of July and the first week of September. And so they take 6 weeks off and then return and are like, oh, whoops, we got to do this, when they haven't done everything in the year prior. So they're supposed to have a year to do this, but because they've been operating on these repeated CRs and didn't finally pass a budget until the fiscal year was halfway over, there's a shorter window to get started on things. And so there's just, it's a pure mismanagement of time and resources. And the things that you see on the floor for the past year are votes like the gas stoves, Save Our Stoves Act, where they're like political messaging bills about gas stoves, or, you name it, any like political hot button issue. That's what they do. They haven't done anything of real substance since taking over the majority in this Congress. And this is what happens. People forget that under Donald Trump, there were multiple government shutdowns, including the longest one in history that extended through the new year. And until Democrats took the majority back, they entered into Congress in a shutdown and had to resolve the issue right away. And so this is very textbook behavior. That it's happening right before an election is unsurprising, I think, to a lot of people. But the motivating factor of wanting to be on the campaign trail, not wanting to be in Washington, is going to help get things done. That's why, for example, Chuck Schumer is filing cloture today It's a legislative process that begins a clock ticking of when they could actually vote on something on what's called a vehicle or a shell bill. And that way, if there is a compromise this week, they can stick it into that and they can vote on it and be out of here before the weekend, because no member of Congress wants to work on the weekend ever. And so there might not be a compromise. There probably won't. It'll probably be next week or the week after, if there is one. But he's doing this in the event that he can, get something through without having to come in on a Saturday or, God forbid, a Sunday.
Yeah. So just to talk about that a little bit, you're talking now about the kind of procedural maneuvering that the Democratic Senate is doing to set up, to be ready to roll. If the House were to get their act together and actually send something over, that they'd be able to move on it very quickly and painlessly without a lot of, by essentially getting these procedural steps out of the way in advance. I guess one thing I'm wondering is, will that remain Schumer's plan? Like for how long does the House have to continue wandering around stepping on rakes before Schumer would potentially say, okay, well, we're going to get the bit in our teeth on this one and send you guys over a plan and you can kind of take that or leave it. Obviously, a lot of this stuff is supposed to start in the House, but how does that look like from a strategic standpoint for Democrats in the Senate?
So what gets to the floor is in control of who leads the floor. Goes for both chambers. So anything that happens has to go through Mike Johnson. You might hear people talk about a discharge petition. Those people don't know what they're talking about, because a discharge petition is something that has to sit in committee for X amount of days, and there's not enough legislative days left for anything to move. Plus, discharge petitions often never go anywhere because of how partisan the House is. So if you hear that, which you usually do, just forget about it for anyone watching. What matters is, what is Johnson willing to sacrifice? And that has to include his own speakership, potentially. I don't think they would oust him before the election, but if he passes a CR that's horribly unpopular with the Republican faction and they keep their majority in the House, they might not let him be speaker again in January, because they have to select a new one anyway. They still might not let him, even if he doesn't do this. So there's the risk that he has to take there. He also has to figure out what exactly Democrats in the House will agree on and what Senate Democrats will agree on and the White House will agree on. Democrats control 2/3 of this equation because they have the Senate and they have the White House. And the House of Representatives is functioning like they have all the cards. They don't. They're behaving the way they've behaved for the past 2 years, which is to dictate the schedule without really having a goal of what they're actually going to accomplish. They're always kind of winging it at the end, and this is no different.
Yeah, it really is kind of this unbelievable headlock where Republicans are the ones who are playing with the least amount of actual leverage, except for the fact that they are the ones, some small subset of whom, but also including the former president, have it in their heads that a government shutdown is not like this catastrophic event coming down the pipe, unbelievably wasteful, unbelievably damaging to the economy, unbelievably kind of unkind and unfair to the millions of federal workers that it actively harms, as well as all the people who benefit from their work that it kind of secondarily harms. But these people don't see those consequences as like, okay, that is Armageddon and Judgment Day, and so we absolutely have to feel the pressure and come to some kind of agreement before then. There are some of these people who think, if the government shuts down, that just means the government's saving a little money because the money's not going out the door, and also it proves that we're fighting. So it really is just kind of this headlock that they've got the whole body in right now, and I guess we'll see whether they muddle through. They have in the past a few times here, but yeah, just continue limping on down the road, I guess.
And the government, that's like a misconception. Is like, when I'll talk to Republican members of the House, some of them, not all of them, but some will say, oh, like it's good when the government shuts down, or like, I don't mind the government not spending money. But that's not what happens. It's not like that money never gets spent. It's just a lapse. And so it creates havoc in all these different areas, depending on which agencies are effective. Sometimes shutdowns can be partial. Sometimes they can be full. That's why whenever you're planning a trip to a national park, you should always check the appropriations lapses. Never go to a national park, never plan a vacation for the end of September, because that's usually when the deadline is. Because you could get there and suddenly everything's closed and you can't even enter the parking lot. That's a small complaint, but if you think of the park rangers that work there, their paychecks might be furloughed. And so, yes, they'll get furloughed and their paychecks will be delayed. And so they ultimately get that money back when the appropriations is completed and government funding is passed. But if you think about the number of Americans who live from paycheck to paycheck, that can have catastrophic effects across the economy. If you look at an entire class of federal workers who aren't top income earners, post office employees, park rangers, you name it. And there's these positions all across every sector of the economy. When they don't get paychecks for days, weeks, who knows, the longest shutdown was, I think it was more than a month. That can have real significant effects on everything. People can't afford things because yes, that money will eventually come, but they don't have it right away, especially if they're living paycheck to paycheck. And so there's a lot of problems. If there's a shortage of employees places, it can lead to delays in anything you want to get accomplished that involves an agency affected by this process. And so there's a lot that happens from a government shutdown that I think a lot of the members of Congress who think, oh, it's just government not spending money, it actually does, and it does affect real people. And so this process seems like just regular racehorse chaos in Washington, but it's a huge concern for a lot of people, and can, either directly or indirectly affect anyone in the United States.
Yeah, and just to put kind of a bow on it, like the thing, just to reiterate, the thing that Republicans are working so hard to make happen in order to avoid all of that chaos, and like the thing that they're willing to risk all of that chaos in order to try to strong arm Democrats to get, is this completely phantasmagorical piece of legislation about illegal immigrants voting, which they already don't. Just to be clear. And I mean, the most amazing thing about it all to me is that it is all downstream from Trump, who is not really part of this process. He just kind of comes along again every once in a while, pokes his head in the door and says, by the way, don't forget to shut down the government if they won't give you the SAVE Act, and then goes back to whatever else he's up to, posting, memes on Truth Social. And the rest of the Republicans are like, all right, I guess that's our plan. The quarterback called the play and now we're going to run the play. And again, I mean, not to belabor this point either, but all as part, as you mentioned, all as part of Trump's effort to kind of pre-salt the earth of trust in this upcoming November election, because this bill is not going to be passed. It's not going to be part of federal law. Democrats are not going to negotiate with terrorists on this one. So there will be some compromise that does not involve the SAVE Act that will eventually get through. And then 2 months from now, Donald Trump will be yammering about how, I mean, assuming he doesn't just win, but if he loses to Kamala Harris, he will be yammering about how this is part of the reason why he lost, because of tens of thousands of illegal immigrants all over the country.
And some people think, and like the Republicans I've spoken to have been like, well, why don't Democrats just support this, even if they believe correctly that undocumented immigrants aren't voting in elections, because it would just be like a double illegal, because it's already illegal. But the purpose of this bill, the reason why Democrats won't support it, is not just because of that, but because it purges voter rolls. It creates unnecessary barriers for U.S. citizens who want to register to vote, like requiring proof of citizenship and proof of all these extra things. It can create all these barriers that could prevent a lot of people who typically want to vote Democrat from being able to vote. People who have a right to vote, citizens of the United States, it'll prevent a lot of them from getting that done. And that is why it is a non-starter for Democrats, because if it passes, it can have devastating effects on the ability to vote for who knows how many Americans. But it can scare people who are afraid of severe punishments for being involved in the registering of someone who maybe shouldn't have been able to register to vote, which again, there's not a lot of evidence actually happens. So Democrats don't want it to pass. And then if it doesn't pass, well, then Republicans can use it as this scapegoat to say, well, the election's rigged because we didn't prevent undocumented immigrants from voting. The reason why the immigrant voting narrative has formed too is because they're kind of a faceless group of people without legal recourse. If you saw in 2020, the people, they were kind of scrambling of who to blame for their election denial claims. And some of them were voting machine companies, poll workers. A lot of these people have legal recourse and have sought that. That's why Fox News had to fork over almost $1 billion to these voting machine companies. Just saying, oh, illegal immigrants, that's not an individual that can have legal recourse against you. And so it's a much easier scapegoat. And that's why you've seen this narrative form just at a snowball effect since Chip Roy first introduced this bill. Once they got the idea, they've been rolling with it. And I can almost guarantee that if the election isn't a Republican landslide, you'll start to see those claims.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens over the next few days. We'll be covering all this up at the Bulwark. You can head over to thebulwark.com to get my newsletter, Morning Shots, to get Joe's newsletter, Press Pass, about the stuff that's going on up at the Hill. Thank you all for joining us and watching today, and we'll see you soon.